get into it now. So Councillor Calvert's given me the opportunity to chair today. So we've got a very exciting topic, the Planning Bill and Natural Environment Bill Council submission. Maybe not everyone thinks that's super exciting, but it is for me. So we'll jump straight into the slides. We think we'll do questions at the end. So thank you, Michael and Andrew.
Yeah, have you guys, do you want to go to the first slide? So, kia ora, councillors. Just want to welcome Andrew, Michael Dundam, who's acting strategic planning, of course, Sean, who's looking after city consenting compliance at the moment, and I think we've got some comm support in the back here today. We've broken this presentation up. There's only 14 slides. I understand they have been circulated. We've got two sections, really. You know, what the areas of support are, which are very large generally, so we haven't spent a whole lot of time on them. But also we wanted to highlight and surface the officers' concerns that we're seeing in some of the components of the bill. So we'll spend some time on that. And there are only 14 slides and we do have an hour. So Mr. Chairman's keen to perhaps take the whole presentation in full and in its entirety, and then we'll pause and start taking some questions of detail. Many thanks. And look, just so we can remind everyone, this is heading to the 19th of February Finance Committee, and because we're due to submit by the 20th of February to the Select Committee. So over to you, gents.
Kia ora koutou. So this set of planning reform is kind of once in a generation. We've been on RM reform on repeat for a little while now. But it looks like this is going to be the change that comes through, and there seems to be some support from both sides of the political spectrum and central government. So some quite substantive changes in terms of the approach for planning, in terms of the policy approach. The intention is really to try and settle a lot of the resource management issues at sort of the plan making stage. There's an intention to have a much more strategic focus by having our land use plans and our natural environment plans grounded by spatial plans. So that will be the avenue that will guide where the big moves happen in the region and in cities. And that is intended to take a regional approach. So there will be an opportunity to look at city-specific things, similar to what we've got with our city spatial plan, but really the intention is to have a regional spatial plan and all of your regulatory plans sit underneath that, and then the intention for that is to then simplify the whole planning system. So all of the major disagreements and agreements around what you can and can't do will be settled at that policy stage rather than being relitigated through resource consents. So I just wanted to put that context in place at the start just to help you understand the intention from the system and how that might differ from the RMA, where we've seen quite a lot of engagement at the consenting phase. Our recent district plan review process has tried to take a step away from that and tried to settle some of the big moves there as well, if we think around intensification. And this is kind of an evolution of that through this new legislation. So in the consenting and compliance space, and Sean, feel free to chip in here if you've got some advice as well, the intention really is to try and make it a lot more permissive. So the plans will set out what you can and can't do, and that's similar to what we've got with the district plan at the moment, but with a much greater intention to remove regulatory barriers for people to use their property. So what will that mean? There will be more activities permitted, so you don't need a consent. There will be fewer consent applications, and there will be a lot less tension at the application stage. There will be a clear plan for people to understand what they can do with their property. So the system intends that there will be fewer effects that will be considered as part of your consenting processes. That should all be settled at your plan level. And what will be quite different from the RMA is that there's going to be a much greater emphasis on enforcement and compliance. So that is a thing that we are supposed to be doing through the RMA at the moment, but I think the experience over the last 30 years or so under the RMA has probably been that hasn't been as much of a focus in the resource management system. but there will be a much greater role for that in the system, because there will be a lot more permissibility, but there will be an expectation that councils will ensure that where things have been allowed, if things aren't sort of going to plan, that there's a plan to actually address that, rather than relying on the public to complain and find out whether things are working or not through a reactive mechanism. So a lot more proactive approach to consenting and compliance. On the regional planning front, so under the RMA at the moment, there's a little bit of duplication around certain functions. So there'll be certain things that we do, certain things that the regional council does. Earthworks is a good example of that. We control kind of minor earthworks around subdivision and things like that. But when there are major earthworks, then that kicks into a regional council responsibility to manage. So developers might have to get consents from both us and the regional council for some of their developments. So the intention is to make sure there's a clear delineation between what local TAs do and then what a regional function might deliver instead. There is a real intention to take a more collaborative approach around regional planning, and you can see that through some of the system reform proposals. So there's a report coming up next week as well around the System Improvement Bill for local government. And as part of that broader picture around local government reform, I guess a much clearer signal around working collaboratively across regions, sort of the spectre of amalgamation, etc. Sean?
Yes, an important clarification here is when it says regional spatial plan, it doesn't mean a spatial plan done by the regional council. It means a spatial plan done regionally by the different councils cooperating together.
Correct. And the real importance of the spatial plan also is that it will go hand in glove with your roles in terms of setting your LTPs. So there'll be an intention that the regional spatial plan will set some high-level direction around where growth might happen, major developments might be supported, and then there'll be an expectation that we will create zoning provisions, district plan or land use plan rules to make that happen. And then to ensure that there's actually infrastructure in place to support that, that will need to flow through into things like long-term plan decisions. So the intention is to try and close some of that gap in the current system where you might have district plans set up to unlock land for development, but it relies on other decisions that may not be required to be given effect to through your long-term plan. So there's a real problem in that space through the planning system at the moment. The intention is to try to resolve that. So there's clear understanding for developers and residents about what you might have happen in your own backyard or next door or in your neighbourhood, and that if there's a intention to rezone something, then you can expect that there'll be infrastructure that comes with that to enable it to happen. So the other key thing here is that to help understand what may or may not be possible, and this will support the regional spatial plans as well, as we'll have environmental limits that will kind of set the thresholds around where development might happen. So those environmental planning issues around water, high-class soils, ecosystem services, so ECNAs and things like that, that'll help set what can happen in your local plans. So it's kind of similar to what we have now, but that'll be factored into the regional spatial plan, so that'll set the kind of the strategic intent, and it'll flow down through into the rest of the system. In terms of timelines, things are pretty tight. So we expect the bill to be passed in the middle of the year, and then that will then lead to some new national policy direction coming from central government. So that's expected early next year. That will help inform the approach that councils will need to take to draft up their regional spatial plans. So we can expect things in there around updates to the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, for instance. So how and where and what councils should do to enable growth. And then there's a very short time frame then around getting that notified, having hearings, because this is going to set the clear direction for the whole planning system at a regional and local level. That has to be done by March 2028. And then that provides the opportunity then for councils to start drafting their replacements for their district plans, which in the new system are called land use plans. So the intention is to have everything completed from a transition perspective by June 2029, and that will assist council with things like its 2030 long-term plan, where things like the developer levy system will also be required to come in. And so that will help fund your infrastructure to unlock the land use opportunities that have come through that planning process. So it's a very short timeframe, quite different from the previous government's sort of 10-year signal for transition under the old system that they had put forward and was repealed. We can expect that there'll be a transitional type arrangement in place, and that over time refinements to both the regional spatial plan and the land use plans will follow. So I think there will be, in practice, quite a lot of taking what exists and not necessarily grandfathering it, but using it as a good starting point to set up the new system. We're going to go into a bit of detail now around the submission and what we've put into it now. I'm just going to hand over to Andrew Walton now just to talk you through some of that.
Thanks. Good morning, councillors. So the submission does pull up to the front some key areas of support and some key areas where the council would recommend changes. There's also, in the end of the submission, a table with a whole bunch of more technical things that staff around the council have said, oh, this doesn't work quite well, let's try and fix it. So in this presentation, I'll just focus on those about 8 key areas of support and 7 areas for change. Of course, if there are any more technical stuff that you've seen in the draft submission that you'll want to ask about, then feel free to do so. Yeah, the main areas of support that we've pulled out to really highlight, the first being that national policy direction is very helpful for us, in particular getting that consistency between different types of national direction. In the past, there's been problems where perhaps the coastal environment policy has disagreed with the infrastructure policy, and then we've said, well, which one takes precedence? And then it goes to a hearing, and it sometimes goes all the way to the High Court and Appeal Court. So for them to sort that out nationally would be an excellent idea. Standardised zone content will be a new thing for us as a council. In the past, we may have had some standardised provisions that we put in, but for the most part, each council creates its own. The intent from the government is that for most of the zones, it will be here as a zone with this is what the activities are, this is what the yards are, this is what the conditions are. And there'll be some opportunities to change it, but for the most part it'll be standard. So in some ways it's very helpful for people to understand, okay, if you want to be zoned industrial, oh yeah, that's what this means. Or medium density residential, oh okay, that's what this means in both Porirua and Wellington and Lower Hutt, it's pretty much the same. So the arguments can be more around, is this the right zone, rather than, well, should it be 1.5 or 2.2 metres yard? So we thought that was good. Obviously, Mike has talked about the regional spatial plans and the connection between land use and infrastructure. In particular, for the first time really, spatial plans being given a bit of teeth to actually have some effect on things like your regional land transport plan, your long-term plan, and your land use plans. There's actually a connection that we have to have regard to that spatial plan now. So it's not just something that councils can do and then perhaps ignore if it doesn't work. So it's really making sure that those connections between what we fund and what we allow to be developed are stronger. And Mike's also mentioned the idea about setting environmental limits. So the human health limits are being planned to be set nationally, and the environmental ones to be set regionally. That's recognising that we've got different environments throughout the country, and what might be suitable in a highly urbanised hilly area here might be quite different from the Waikato. But for things like human health limits for water quality, for example, it's great that, and even for things like wastewater discharges, I hate to bring that up, but it's a good example of that, to not have those arguments either at that regional plan or land use plan level, but just being set nationally. The next one is is some smaller things that will just make life a bit easier for us in terms of the bureaucracy. One is that if you get a resource consent, that means that actually you should probably have a different zone in your plan, that the consent can allow the district plan, which will be a land use plan, to be updated to reflect that. An example is in Kandala, we had a resource consent granted for the New World to expand the area into a residential area. And so now they've got this awkward situation where their activity is consented but is in a residential area, but it's actually functioning as a commercial area. They could potentially say and apply to the council to say, actually, as part of this, we also want your zones adjusted to reflect this new land use. Seems more efficient than having to go through two separate processes. There's also the idea of having temporary or future application for planned provisions. So an example of that might be our Lincolnshire farm, to say, okay, we want to zone this area to identify this is where the houses go, this is where the businesses will go, but we don't want people to start building there until we've got the infrastructure in. So once the road gets put in, these rules apply, but until then they don't apply. So that's that temporary idea or future application. It's something that technically could be done and was done occasionally under the current system, but it was never really explicit. So it's nice to have that confirmed so that we don't get any legal challenges around it. Likewise with adaptive management approaches, probably less significant for us, more for a regional approach, but it could be something unusual and unexpected, perhaps maybe a campground in a rural zone that has a small gravel road, and we could say, okay, let's do an adaptive management, allow the campground to go, and see how the traffic, see how the traffic is created or causes problems. If it does cause problems, we can look at the consent. If it's all fine, maybe it gets expanded. Could be an example. And the deemed permitted activities is, again, it's an administrative thing which should be helpful. A recent example was Zealandia they're looking to upgrade their fence, and they were saying, oh, we actually need to move it in a few places 5 metres in this direction. And it's like, well, actually you need a resource consent for that, but you shouldn't, because you're pretty much the same or similar effects. The effects are minor, and it's as if it were permitted. So this would allow those sort of minor things to just be done, be ticked off by the council, not have to go through a whole resource consent process.
So what you're seeing is, at the moment, our consent officers must display considerable creativity when some of these situations like Zealandia come up, because nobody wants to get in the way of conservation. What this is doing is removing that need to desperately re-engineer a solution at the end of the process and moving it into an actual standardised process within the law, which should make it easier for our consenting officers.
So I'll move into the 7 areas where we think there could be improvement. The first being a major one. This has been raised by councils, and also other bodies like Infrastructure New Zealand, and have expressed some degree of concern with this concept of regulatory relief. In brief, what it is that if the council wants to apply protection for specified topics, being historic heritage, outstanding landscapes and features, outstanding natural landscapes and features, size of significance to Māori, or high natural character of the coast, rivers, wetlands, on private land, then there needs to be some sort of relief framework for those landowners to, if there's an impact on their reasonable use of the land. So that could be a combination or an options of perhaps rates relief, some sort of financial compensation, maybe some sort of works to support them. It could be non-financial, but we expect there would be a financial component for council. If someone's asked for that plan change, then of course it wouldn't apply. These would also apply to rules that are carried through from our current plan. So, for example, we have protections for historic heritage. When that's carried through into the new plan, there could be a requirement for us to provide some sort of compensation, really, for them not being able to develop their land to the same as the other properties around them. So the way that the text is worded in the submission is to point out that it's not just councils going out and saying, oh, we want to protect everything. That there's actually a reason why we do this, and it's coming from the legislation and national direction, and sometimes from regional direction too, saying you need to protect historic heritage. You need to, sometimes there's national direction saying you must identify areas of high natural character and protect them. So it's a little unfair for us to get this direction from on high, and then telling us, and also you need to compensate landowners. So in a nutshell, that's what the submission point is kind of worded around. So the solution requested is either remove the regulatory relief and perhaps take it back to something that the RMA uses, like there's a reasonable use condition in the Resource Management Act, where if something's patently unreasonable, you can either compensate them for that, but through the Environment Court, but more likely what happens is you just change the plan provision. It's used occasionally. It's a nice release valve. It works quite well. If they do decide to keep their regulatory relief, there's a few options for them, and they are worded kind of politically. So there may be things that you want to look at and consider if this is how you want to phrase it. But for example, things such as if we're required to provide regulatory relief, then the rates cap should not apply because this is an additional cost above that. If the government is requiring us to protect something, the government should be paying. So it's those sort of things. Say just reminding perhaps the select committee that this is an additional cost on council, and that perhaps there's a more collaborative way to go about this. So I realise it's slightly complex.
Might pay, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, just to pause about this particular item. And it is true, there are a number of councillors concerned. I mean, it sort of appears as an unfunded kind of liability to us, and so we wanted to be quite careful about how we put this submission forward. And so if councillors have any further deeper questions on this one, it's a good time to stop now. We've been trying to model how this might play out. And there are a number of situations, as Andrew's already really well articulated, around top-down imposition of controls, natural environment protection, national kind of significance. And so we're sort of a little bit uneasy about how the power imbalance plays out here. And of course, ultimately, any type of question about relief has to come from some either financial or other type of incentive, which in part will cost us. Whether that might be, you can do rates relief, well, someone has to pick up the slack on that. Officers' time to help advise how you might develop your heritage property within the bounds, or that's all a cost, a bottom line cost to us. So happy to explore that now.
Cool. We had some questions from earlier, but we'll just do ones on this part and then we can cover those after. I've got one to start. I'll just quick one. Is it clear that our preference is for it to be removed over those other solutions that were mentioned there?
Yes, Chair. Currently, it says preferably remove the regulatory relief requirements entirely. If a regulatory relief framework is retained, then we would propose the following changes.
Cool. Thanks. We'll go to Councillor Randall.
Yeah, I've got two questions. One is just to confirm, we're required to, as a council and other councils, to protect things from all sorts of parts of other government. So this isn't really about, what local government Act says or anything like that, or the RMA. It's about what happens to the Environment Act or the Heritage Act or the whatever other act that comes along, or any one of them could put an obligation for us to protect things. Is that where that's coming from?
Yes, so you could receive a direction to protect something under, say, a national policy statement. You could receive something under a court order, or you could receive something under another Act of Parliament. So, say there was a change in the Scheduled Land or the Conservation Act, and you needed to move the land zoning to be the same. It is slightly complicated to answer questions on this in the absence of a lot of that national direction, which will define what those standardised zones are. There's also an inherent tension within this topic in that the planning system in part defines property rights. It doesn't. Those property rights aren't necessarily inherent to the land without that definition, and so what you could have is effectively an incentive to apply the least permissive zone to a piece of land in order to minimise the regulatory relief, because what you're paying for is effectively the difference between what you could do under the zone and what you can do under the protection control.
And my second question is, while we're talking private property, the council itself has very extensive land holdings and is very heavily involved in supporting all sorts of often quite sensitive areas. Does this mean that we can claim compensation should protection come along, or is it really focused more on just the private landowners and we sort of pick up the tab?
It is only for private land, council land.
I'll go to Councillor Chung.
Great, thanks. I also have two questions. The first question is on the consent applications. Now, reading that there are going to be fewer consent applications, so therefore, what do we have any thinking?
Chung, is that a question related to the regulatory relief?
Oh, okay. I'll ask the
We'll do
regulatory
those.
relief. Okay,
Thank you.
I'll just ask that one there. Regarding the regulatory relief, the government tells us to protect things. So I'm assuming that those things that the government would want us to protect would probably be on either Greater Wellington Regional Council land, or it wouldn't be on private land, wouldn't it? Like if they want to say protect the snail or something on this particular land, it's not going to likely be on private land, is it?
Occasionally it is, yes. So the principle that the government's bringing in through this is recognising that for these specified topics, for those protection, the benefit is to the public, but the cost is to the private landowner. So they're trying to rebalance that a bit with some sort of relief to the private landowner. So, I mean, that's a political call that they've made. It's just unfortunately that there are financial implications for a council that has to administer it.
And just to reiterate as well, the specific topics that the regulatory relief would apply to are historic heritage, outstanding natural landscapes and features, sites of significance to Māori, high natural character of coast, rivers, wetlands and lakes, and yeah, once again, only private land.
We'll go to Councillor Calvert.
Thank you. This reminds me a bit of SNA's significant natural areas. So is this the sort of thing that would apply?
Yes, so the previous council reasoned their way through this very topic with what form of compensation could be given to landowners for SNAs, and as you recall, it became extremely complicated and quite fraught. And so what this is effectively doing is looking at how could such an economic concept be placed directly into the law.
So, I mean, if this as SNAs were up, I mean, one of the issues that we had is landowners' value of their properties were being devalued through a sort of zoning of an SNA, and also they were restricted from doing what they wanted to be able to do with that land. In fact, a lot of them were maintaining the significant natural area anyway. So would this mean that if the government's proposal went ahead and SNAs were imposed, we may well then have to fund partly the loss of value of that land, and that could be through rates relief or whatever?
Effectively,
Yeah.
yes.
And so we're going to object to this, basically.
Yes, so as Mr. Wharton said, our preference is for the removal of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Councillor Al-Rubai.
Thank you. I think actually Councillor Calvert has asked that question, is that I'm quite concerned about what the amount of liability that we will have to sort of cover, but also more vulnerable landowners that are not able to comply, or so I'm not too sure if I mean that could be worded a little bit stronger, or
So I hear two questions. One is, how might this apply to vulnerable landowners, and how could that vulnerability be accounted for? Within the law itself, it doesn't make a particular distinction between the circumstances of the land of any two particular landowners, other than that such a control would apply to them. However, there is a provision to create a policy. This is where it becomes a little uncertain for us, because I'm not sure that in the creation of such a policy you could account for it. I'm also not sure that you couldn't. So
I'd probably just to finish, we'll crack on, but I'll just finish. I suppose to a certain degree, councillors, we also provide a form of regulatory relief for our historic heritage. We have a grant fund, don't we? And so, well, for now, for that particular component. So, you know, we are active in this space, and as Councillor Calvert mentioned, I mean, SNAs were very contentious. We couldn't, you know, it was very complex trying to understand what economic relief looks like for putting SNAs in residential private land, and we chose not to.
Councillor Finn.
So is the challenge, what is the question you're asking us? I guess it feels like a political officer
It very much is, and
balancing act. And how could we help?
Well, I think that's the wonderful thing about planning. It has a very strong political component to it. I think we're getting a very clear steer today that you are uncomfortable with the regulatory relief component, and we just wouldn't want to put it publicly. Although this is a public meeting, we just wanted to show you that, hey, we're heading down this direction. It sounds like we're on the right path. So
Yes, it does.
Cool. We'll move through the slides now.
Thank you, Chair. The next topic is probably something that was intended to be quite a useful tool, but unfortunately the way it's worded has turned out to be very difficult. And so that's requiring permitted activities to be registered with the council, and then councils having to monitor those activities, and people having to get affected party or affected persons sign-offs, and perhaps pay a fee for monitorings and things. So given that in the new system there's not like a controlled type activity where we would normally do this sort of thing, in principle, it makes sense to have a tool where if there's a particular type of activity where we want to monitor effects, but we don't want to require a consent, that there is a process for that. Unfortunately, it's worded as a must in there, so we're just foreseeing all sorts of bureaucracy of having to go out to a local business and say, how much parking do you have on your property? Do two or more people really live here? You know, and checking that they're meeting the permitted activity conditions. In practice, the vast majority of permitted activities just go ahead and do their thing without councillors being involved. And I know, you know, this is kind of following on from what Michael was saying earlier, that there is a push for activities to be monitored better, and for adverse effects or environmental effects to be identified earlier and fixed, because there's a concern that there's too much permissiveness on small things leading to large environmental effects. So the submission recognises that, and recognises that there are some benefits here, but applying it to everyone seems incredibly bureaucratic and costly. And the intent may be that they are only in regulations. They may say, oh, well, permitted activities only actually applies to these activities, but that's not set out in the law. And even if it is, there's still going to be activities that fall through the cracks, and you're requiring some grandmother to pay thousands of dollars in administration fees. And so what the submission asks for is essentially to either suggesting that we have permitted activities just keep being permitted activities, and have these things being more registered activities where council can define what falls in where. The other option is just to make it from a must to a may. So council has a discretion that if there's a certain activity, perhaps it's something in a light industrial area that could potentially have some sort of odour or traffic problems that need monitoring, and as a business that can handle that, great. But we're not going to be monitoring and requiring thousands of dollars for some person with a home business. So I think it's a practical solution, and it's probably going back to, hopefully, what Parliament intends with this bill to make things easier. The bills have changed the the roles of tangata whenua and mana whenua in the planning system, arguably in two ways. Firstly, the current Resource Management Act has a requirement to have regard to the principles. Have regard? Is that the right word? Of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, and that's been removed. And the second thing it does is that it specifies how Te Tiriti o Waitangi has been applied through the various procedures of the Act, and actually, which in some ways can be helpful perhaps to make that clear. There's actually a third way, which is some of the existing functions in the RMA to get tangata whenua involvement have been removed. For example, we have the opportunity to do mana whakahono arohe, which is an iwi participation arrangement. If you've got an existing one, that can continue, but you can't make any new ones. The ability to transfer or delegate powers to iwi authorities is currently in the Resource Management Act. It's not in the Planning Act. This is an area which we've discussed as staff quite a lot with the other councils in the region and also with the iwi authority representatives or staff, which has been really helpful to make sure that we're in agreement on a common sense or relatively consistent set of recommendations to our councils for the submission. And the recommendations are to bring in a general general principle that in the goals of the Planning Act and Natural Environment Act, that people exercising functions should give effect to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and that it's a reasonable innovation to perhaps specify how iwi can be involved in different areas, but that shouldn't be used as an opportunity to remove functions. So the submission adds some additions that could be added. For example, what we're saying with the opportunity for delegated powers and opportunity to have mana whenua representatives on hearing committees, on spatial planning committees, that sort of thing. It's not saying that this needs to happen, but it's saying that if this is something that the council and mana whenua would like to do, that we want to make sure that the Act empowers that to happen. So that's the line that's taken with this one. We could move on, Chair?
Yep.
Okay. The bill specifies...
Sorry, we've just got one question from Councillor Finn.
Yeah, we've just had quite an urgent email from the Mayor's office that needs to be responded to, and so I'm conscious that most of us are trying to deal with that. Could we give a 10-minute adjournment?
Let's have a pause.
That this is...
questions, and if there are things in the presentation, we can provide that in the answers to your questions.
Thank you.
Thanks. We'll go to Councillor Fern. You had a question from the start of the presentation.
Yeah, I've got a few actually. I guess what I want to understand about the moving the environmental functions to the regional system, just one of the big challenges I see is the stormwater issue, whereas Wellington we had a requirement to have X amount of land and development being a permeable surface so that we've got stormwater solutions happening. How will that treatment be treated, or sorry, I don't have the technical language, but how will the regional way, if we're trying to standardise everything, treat that, for example?
That depends upon the settings which are agreed in the spatial plan to begin with and where priority for investment and development take place. It will also then filter through into the land use plans through the standardised zones, which I would expect to have rules on permeability and solutions in them.
Great, okay. Just regarding more enforcement and compliance, how would that be, for example, retrofitted? And I won't bring up one particular area of Wellington where we're aware of some maybe not so compliant building structures happening, how would this impact on that? How would we see buildings in the past?
So at present, in the City Consenting and Compliance Unit, you've got a number of teams, but the two that are pertinent here are enforcement and monitoring, and then consenting. So at the moment, what happens is we impose conditions through a resource consent, and then the compliance of those is monitored by that enforcement team. What you would end up with is the movement of resource from the consenting team to the compliance team. And what you would have is the registration of permitted activities with that compliance team in order to then be monitored. The difficulty with doing that is there's a certain scale of effects we are interested in when it comes to running a city. You can't worry about every single thing, because if you do, you will go insane and you won't get anything done. The difficulty we have is in the way the word law is written, that scale of effects is unclear to us, and it begins to look like everything is going to have to be registered, which is not really what I think is necessary to run the city. It also won't generate efficiency if I simply move staff from one department to another.
Yeah. Okay.
Just the other thing to note, on the compliance and monitoring side of things, there will be a requirement for councils to develop a compliance and monitoring strategy, and that will set up, I guess, the approach that the council will take to resourcing and responding to the land use plans. So there'll be quite a bit that will need to be worked through in that space. So that's not something that is currently required in the RMA, and it's really is tied, as Sean said, to consent conditions. And then nuisance complaints. That's kind of the approach that we've got at the moment, but the intention really is to take a lot more of a proactive approach in that space in the future.
Okay. Last question, temporary or future applications. In the last district plan, we were trying to make sure the number one route was available for MRT, and legally or whatever, we couldn't do that. So will this, allow cities to designate temporarily routes for, transport infrastructure in the future?
So in terms of the number one route and its protection, I think the changes being made to the designation process will allow that to take place more easily than in the past. There are changes to the burdens of proof. Under the Resource Management Act, constant reform led to designations essentially becoming almost like another form of consent, rather than the long-term future planning instrument for the transport and utility system it was intended to be. In saying that, designations are the last part of the Town and Country Planning Act to remain more or less intact, so it is a very, very difficult problem to solve.
If I can just add to that, so the regional spatial plans will also be a role where future potential transport links, such as an MRT, can be identified, given it's got the 30-plus year period, so it goes beyond the current council budgets. And one of the submission points does mention about how that particular designation function for future road protection could be made a bit better. So there's technical detail in the submission on that.
The one final matter that the new system is looking to do with things like transport as well is that in the regional spatial plans where significant infrastructure is identified, is that will need to link into regional transport plans, and then there will be a requirement for that to be considered, and then the funding stream to give effect to that through that process as well.
Councillor Calvert.
Yeah, when you mentioned Kandala New World, my ears pricked up. But my concern, and I can understand the point that you were making, there's been a consent granted, maybe it should be changed to commercial. But my concern there is then you're extending the commercial zone for a suburb, really because of monopolies, or not quite monopolies, wanting to take over, because, for instance, that New World, it wants to have a significant presence in the Onslow Northern area. And so what you're doing then is you're taking away investment from Johnsonville, Johnsonville is our metropolitan centre. So I just want to understand how we can facilitate where things need to happen, but also understand the broader impacts, because what you're then you're then making it less viable for something like Johnsonville, just up the road, to actually be able to be developed properly as what we intend. So I'm just cautious about how you explained it and I wonder whether you could take that into consideration.
Yes, so the spatial plans and their link to the zones become the important piece in there. In that particular case, the example was being used because effectively that consent imposes a development envelope over that site now, that when you go to, if somebody was to buy it, the consent goes with the land, and so the property right becomes effectively inbuilt. It becomes quite confusing as you move on in time, because it's not clear from things like the zoning maps that the community will look at that property right actually exists, and so that's why it was looking to effectively use the consent to put that onto the plan so it becomes clear in the future.
Yeah, I think Diane's broader question is floor area caps. I think so. The point I think we're trying to get from you guys is, and maybe your point around the spatial plan was where you were going with this, Sean.
Yeah.
But how do we stop retail catchments cannibalising others in the spatial plan and planning accent?
So I'm not sure you will be able to. The Minister has made clear that he has asked officials to look more closely into allowing mixed use as of right within more zones. So it will depend upon the content of that national direction as to whether you can or not.
Thank you, but I'd like to see, maybe officers can suggest something, because that will probably, depending on what the submission looks like, it may well be something that we, consider, is how do we make sure that if we're bothering to do a spatial plan and where we want to see development, where we want to see, and how we want to see that development growing, that we're actually, that there is a plan, it's not scattergun. So, because what happens is we've targeted, say, Johnsonville to have, much more infrastructure, and this waters it down.
Understand, yeah. So I think that the thrust is this concept of a retail hierarchy. And we can think about ways we can present in the submission to council and that can be further debated on the day.
Cool, I'm just conscious of time. We'll get through two more questions. Councillor Chung, you had one on consenting from earlier. Do you want to ask that?
Yes, thanks. Looking at we're going to have fewer resource consent applications, but we're going to have a larger responsibility for developers to understand exactly what the conditions are. So their responsibility is look at the rules, go and build what they think they're allowed to do, and then our focus is going to be on compliance of that. So do we have the people, are the people who are currently doing resource applications, are they skilled enough to do the enforcement of this? And would we be looking at, say, a transfer of resource from doing the consents to actually going out and doing enforcements?
So the council is considering a considerable number of submissions across the Local Government Act, RMA, and some of your other systems. All of these come with a very large operational shadow that will need to be considered in future LTPs, and also a complexity coming from how they interact with each other. In terms of our enforcement team, you have had Mr. Borich, the manager of that team, go through noise with you at extensive detail, and you can see the depth of expertise there. So I'm confident that our officers have the expertise necessary to deal with these complex situations. The greater question here is more, if we are to achieve the efficiencies that are being demanded of local government and enforced through rates caps, are we able to do that within these new settings that are coming in the law, or are we being set up to fail?
Cool, we'll go to Councillor Matthews.
Yeah, I'm interested, sort of going back to sort of the beginning about, which seems like quite a significant thing, is the closer relationship between spatial planning and infrastructure spend. And I guess I'm interested, and it may not be a question for this submission, but I'm sort of interested in particularly avoiding any kind of fish hooks for there, because obviously this council is, you know, the challenge of funding the infrastructure that we need, and also the challenge of, you know, supporting and encouraging the housing development that we need. And it's sort of a chicken and egg thing at the moment, and I'm wondering how that actually will work in practice to more closely align them.
So spatial planning has been practiced in New Zealand almost since settlement by Europeans. The difficulty there has been, though, that it has been done in spite of the law, not because of it. So what you're seeing is the encoding of it into the law. The reason it is necessary is precisely, as you say, to ensure that there is the certainty to invest in the infrastructure needed to service development, and it is a cycle. The challenge for us will come from the effective rebuilding of the city's infrastructure in order to service that intensification. Essentially, we do not necessarily have the skeleton to sustain the size of body that is being desired at the moment, so it will need to grow alongside. And in that respect, the development levies bill that is moving through the House, in which Mr Duindam is expert, is probably your better mechanism to debate that.
Councillor Wirrawati.
Thank you. Very quickly, noting that you Māori have been already consulted and agreeing with it. In terms of the tangata whenua and Te Tiriti aspects, and given that 68% of voters voted to retain the Māori ward, can we take that as a mandate and ensure that the wording and the enforcement that we're putting through in our recommendation for Te Tiriti is going to be strong enough to reflect that?
We have worked with our mana whenua partners to create a consistent wording across the region. If you wish to go further than that wording within the submission, then we would be open to amendment to do it, but it is very much for you to judge. I would say there is one other change within the Act, which is very subtle, but does have some impact on us, which is a change from a reliance on Māori within the RMA to a reliance on the provisions of treaty settlements. So that does mean that previously we would also engage with groups that are not mana whenua but are Māori within district plan processes. That doesn't seem to be in the new Act. New bill, sorry.
Councillor Osborne.
Thank you, Chair. Just a really quick question around the climate change provisions. I see that a bullet point there's no mention of greenhouse gas reductions, i.e. mitigation. And recognising that planning is always done for a variety of reasons, but if we were to make planning decisions around land use, transport, infrastructure, in order to try and mitigate the impact of climate change, would that, under this new legislation, leave us open to challenge?
That's what's set out in the draft submission, is the concern that that aspect of council's involvement in reducing emissions is not mentioned, and so there's a potential risk that it's not seen as a function, and so the important role of spatial planning and of aligning low emissions urban forms and transport systems to reduce emissions long term and to allow other tools to and people to choose to reduce emissions should be specifically included in the Act.
And final question for Councillor Fern.
Two questions from me. One was around the noise regulations, recognising that Minister Bishop has stepped up and said he would look to solve the challenges that urban centres are having trying to deal with noise through events happening in cities. Like, does the, what are we proposing to put in the submission to support change, as Minister Bishop has said he would support?
The submission largely follows the points that were raised in Council's previous submission on the Going for Housing Growth document, and also what you've asked us to do, to basically set clearer direction and regulation on these noisier activities. And if Council has decided to balance up, okay, this is what noise is expected in this area, and this is what's acceptable, therefore we should set a standard in the plan, that then applies. Unfortunately, we've looked through the new Act, and looks to basically take what's currently in the RMA and move it straight into the Planning Act unchanged, which means things such as the unreasonable noise and people being able to lodge complaints under that, or excessive noise provisions, which don't account for plan provisions, remains. So the submission asks for that if a type of noise complies with permitted standards set in a national rule or a plan rule or in a planning consent, that should be what is enforced to, but we've put unless the local authority determines that special circumstances exist in relation to the nature, extent and unanticipated effects, because staff were concerned that if it was just blank, this is a permitted standard, there could be something unexpected that happens. Maybe it's like a deep bass noise which is rattling people's homes, and it just technically happens to fit within a standard that's been agreed. That could still be a problem. I hope that's clear in terms of
Yeah, I might, just when I see the paper, just have it asked to chat about that further. Great,
sure.
Thank you. One last question. On the urban design, there was a comment about waste. Can you just explain effects on street and public space safety and waste? Can you just explain what we're trying to achieve, or what the submission will point to with that?
Certainly, Councillor. The planning bill removes certain effects from consideration, one of them being the internal and external layout of buildings that can't be considered in any planning provisions in our land use plan. And the point the submission makes is that there are certain public-private interface situations where that's actually quite important, particularly the external layout of buildings, and one of those is waste management. So if there isn't space to put bins out in a place where they can be collected, especially in a dense urban environment like in our city centre or in high-density urban areas, that should remain a factor that we can consider. Same with stormwater, likewise. We're not necessarily saying that we want control over, how buildings look or feel, or like how they're placed, because that's clearly what the government is trying to avoid. But we're just simply pointing out that actually there are elements that are remaining important, not just for waste, but those other areas on the slide there that should still remain in scope that we can consider.
So, for example, in the last district plan, we required in ground floor that there was space for an organics collection and multi-unit dwellings. So will the new bill aim to wipe the requirement for that?
So the new bill doesn't intend to do that. It's not saying you cannot, control any waste. It's a consequence of what they're saying. So they're saying we don't want councils to have any control over the external layout of buildings on the site. I don't believe that perhaps, and this is something that could be raised with the Select Committee, which is why I brought it to the front, while the principle may be okay, there are perhaps unintended consequences to that for things such as waste management.
Great, thank you.
Cool. That's all the questions. I understand there's a next step slide if you want to really quickly, we've just run out of time, but if you want to really quickly cover that before we finish up.
So from here, we have the any edits that will, before the paper is finalised, may be possible before the paper is published on tomorrow, basically. And then the committee will be debating the submission on the 19th of February, and then I will lodge it on the 20th. We did get an extra week from the Select Committee, which is good because it allows us to have this time to actually workshop and actually improve the submission so it is from yourselves.
Awesome. Thanks for the presentation and all the work that's gone into this submission from officers. Look forward to reading it. Thanks, everyone.